Well, thank you guys for sticking around. So you're all, everybody that's in here is like entrepreneur, business person now? Ready to fire it up? Yeah? Yes. Cool. Well, anyway, it is as easy as Liz said. You just build the company and you make it an international, thing with multi, lingual pages and no. It's, I'm a big believer now that I don't think, there are exceptions, but the companies that I'm most impressed with in the tech space and other founders that I've met, other entrepreneurs, they've really thought through the process, and it's not the get lucky thing. There's some of the biggest companies that we celebrate. We celebrate them just because they've taken on so much investment. They have such a huge valuation. And I always thought, like, what makes these companies so valuable? Why was, what was the one recently? Pinterest is like $3 billion now or something valuation. And yes, they have some monetization pieces. Foursquare, for example, is not profitable yet. I mean, what makes these companies get these huge valuations? And it's really just that sphere, that venture capital process and that model. And so when I was creating PitchEngine, and even before, my inspiration came from all the things that probably inspire you. Other businesses, I used to read Fast Company and Entrepreneur and Inc. magazine, cover to cover. And the thing that I've learned over a little bit of time is that it sensationalized all those people that maybe didn't sort of create some of the things that we created. And I don't mean to say that in a bad word, but in a bad way, but we sort of put on a pedestal these companies that sort of boomed up out of nothing, and that's great, and they're going to sell it and move on to the next thing. But what happens to all those employees? What happens to those families? What happens to the communities those things are in? I mean, Silicon Valley, maybe that's the way it operates, but as we started to do this in Wyoming, and as we started to build a business, and I brought Fabian aboard, who's our chief operating officer, and is financial minded and more structured than I, and we started to look at this thing like a business. It's a bigger deal than that. It's a lot bigger deal than just building something up and selling it. About a year and a half ago, we had our first major acquisition offer. It was for $9 million, and that's more than myself or my family's probably ever made or seen or whatever. And that was a pretty big deal. That was sort of a critical point for us, and it's critical in lots of ways. I mean, I had never dreamed that would happen. I wanted to create a business that would make a little bit of money, and I remember wishing and hoping that it could make enough so that I could quit my job. I could do it full time. And I think that's what all of us as entrepreneurs, we're striving for. We're trying to create a model that we can monetize and we can actually make some money on it. It can't just be this pie in the sky stuff, and if it works, it works. If it doesn't, the thing I hate is when I read these things about, like, it's okay to fail at least 3 times before your business makes it. That's BS. It's not okay to fail. What thing in life is it okay to fail? When my kid plays soccer, we're going to keep score. I'm sorry. That's just the way it is. That's my mentality. And maybe that's the Wyoming in me. Maybe that's the cowboy upbringing. I don't know. But I think because we're in Wyoming, we're different. I think we're independent. I think we value work ethic in a different way. I think there's a lot of things that were sort of bred into me that I, that sort of contributed to this model. As I started to blog about PR and about marketing, and coming from it as a former journalist, I understood the problems. I understood that a journalist has limited resources. They don't have budgets. Newspapers aren't, if you haven't heard, they're not like making money, so hand over fist. So they have limited resources. So as brands, we have some resources as businesses, and we want to help and we want to empower these journalists to write about us and all those things. And so I kind of knew some of that stuff. So I would blog about it. And I would say, how do you use social media? And wouldn't it be cool if you could share this thing that had video in it and images and all this stuff? And so I started blogging, and I loved it. And I've always been a good communicator. And I think that one of the things as entrepreneurs we need to look at is think of the things that we're just good at, naturally good at. Not all of us are communicators. Not all of us are good producers of video or can take a good picture. Some of us are better on camera, and some of us are better with just blogging with text. And some of us are engineers, you know, and our minds work. We want to put up our code and show people our code, and that's how we communicate. That's okay. You know, that's how you communicate. That's your strengths, but use them. Use them. And you know, we have this discussion a lot. You know, we have friends that are artists and things like that, creative types. And that's great. And I think that's an awesome skill to have. But if you're going to make a business out of it, you've got to be an entrepreneur. You've got to sell it. You got to do all that stuff, or you're not going to be like those other things that make people that make money off their artwork or music or whatever. You've got to be an entrepreneur in this day and age. And I tell my journalist friends and ex-journalist friends, you know, that you've got to get beyond, I work for this publication. You're a brand now. You're creating content. You have a skill set. And so now a lot of these journalists are becoming embedded journalists for companies. They're becoming brand storytellers, chief storytellers, brand journalists at companies. One of my friends was a journalist, had a great gig. He liked it. He was doing cool reporting and fun stuff. And then he went, but he was kind of stalled out a little bit, and the newspaper industry wasn't doing great. So now he's the chief storyteller at Dogfish Head Brewery. And what's more fun than that? I mean, you get to go tell stories about beer to beer drinkers and do cool stuff, and it's fun, and he's still using his crafts and his skills, and it's not any less ethical to tell stories about businesses and passionate people than it is to tell stories about car accidents and you know, arrests. So that's the thing, is leverage some of the skills that you have, because you've all got it and you're all passionate about what you do. You just need to figure out how to put that content out, you know, put it together. So I just blogged. I blogged and I talked about it. And as I was creating PitchEngine in the background, I was creating kind of a following. And I started out on a site called Ning, which was like build your own community, kind of like build your own Facebook. And it had its challenges, but it was free, and that's what I had. And every night I would get home from work and I would just blog. I would think about things, and I would use this sort of tone. And I'm very I'm not afraid to challenge the processes that are out there. You know, when you look at that, and I think that's why I come at entrepreneurship like this, and I come at the tech scene, is because don't assume that process is the process. Why do we assume that you go out and raise money and you build a company and it either makes it or it doesn't? Why assume that? That's silly. So why do we assume that the way to share PR is to create a press release and send it through email and hope somebody reads it? You know, these processes, that somebody just adapted them. Don't be a sheep and follow them. Figure out how to do it cooler and better. You know, if you don't want to print a menu, hand out the Komodo menu card, you know, in the last session, and you know, let people look at your menu on Instagram. You know, whatever. I don't know what that is, but don't just assume that the processes are all the same. And that's what I did, is I looked at that process and I said, all right, here's all these companies, and they're creating press releases, and they're paying a wire service to send them out to a list. Well, isn't that spam? Why is that any different than spam? So these PR services take big bucks, $400 at minimum probably, $250 to $400 for no video or images, just words, to take a press release, and they'll send it to their list of journalists. Well, you think those journalists like getting all those press releases every day? Hundreds and hundreds? They don't, and guess what? They don't get them. So they place them on some third-party sites, and they'll show up on the web, so when you Google your press release, it shows up everywhere. Well, that was good once upon a time when people thought that did something. But guess what? It doesn't do anything. You know, you might get somebody to happen to Google the two words, but they'll never give you metrics on views. They'll only tell you how many people they're sending it to. It's like putting an ad in the newspaper. Do you ever know how many people see that ad? No. You assume that, well, they print this many, so I'm going to pay for that. Well, that stinks, you know? That doesn't make much sense in my head. I want to know, how did this work? So when brands start using social, and they share something through Facebook, or they share something on Twitter, a cool photo they took of their event, and they get people responding, it makes so much, it's a world of difference. That boss, of, you know, whoever that boss is that you've got to prove this to, is going to freak out because they're getting response and people are interacting with it, and they get feedback. And you can't get that with traditional media. And so that was some of the processes that I was blogging about and I was talking about. So I created this site on Ning, and we grew to about 2,000 followers. And I don't think they were even called followers. I don't know what they were, networkers. They have their own terminology, right? So as that grew, I was creating PitchEngine, and I released it in beta form because that's what everybody did. Gmail was still in beta. So I released it in beta, and all these people started using it. Well, the good news is, if you make a product for PR pros, they're probably going to talk about it because they're PR people, right? So they checked it out, they tried it, they were journalists, they were PR pros, they dug it, they started sharing, and they started creating content, and they started sharing. And I had studied a lot, you know, this didn't, you know, it sounds easy when you talk about it, but this was over time, and it was, you know, it was a lot of late nights, and it was a lot of just not sleeping and just doing this, you know, thinking about it, studying this concept of the viral loop, it was called at the time, where you remember back in the day when you'd get an email from somebody, and if they sent it through Hotmail, it said, get your own Hotmail free, that kind of thing. Everybody else was driving it for you. It wasn't you driving it, it was somebody else. And if you empower your users to share it, if you empower people to talk about it, if Budweiser creates a pitch on PitchEngine and shares it with all their customers, those customers see that, and they see that they can create their own free pitch. Oh, I can use this for my business or my nonprofit or my whatever. And so that's how it grew, and that's how it started to sort of take shape. And over time that changes. The business model changes. There's no way I could have written a business plan that would have sort of, I think, really captured, especially where we are today. But that's how I started. And it was very organic, and I only grew it through Facebook, Twitter, and this Ning site, you know, and social media. And I was available 24 hours a day. I talked to anybody. I went to conferences and I spoke, and I blogged, and that's sort of what grew it. That's sort of how it started. I hired my first employee in 2009, right? January 2010. After about a year, I was able to, or maybe more than a year, I was able to hire our first employee, which wasn't myself. And that was in January, and then got a hold of Fabian, and we had worked together in the past, and we went to South by Southwest, and I wanted him to get a taste for what we were doing and sort of what our perception was in the marketplace. And after a week at South by, he was in. He was sober too, and he was still in. And so he came back, and we hired ourselves in March or something like that, right? 3 months later. And, you know, looking back, those were challenging times, you know? I mean, even diving in the first minute that I decided to take this on was, they're all sort of life-changing decisions, I guess. And that's what's fun about the entrepreneur side of things, I guess. I think that's why people get into it. But I don't think they get into it just to raise money and do that stuff. I think they get into it to have a business. And I have tons of peers, tons of friends that have some cool companies, and they sell them, and they regret it, you know, or they take on investment and they get demoted to product manager, and all of a sudden they're not talking to their customers anymore or whatever. And so they're unfortunate things. So I think somebody has to tell the other side of those stories, because all I read about is these companies that blow up or try to blow up, and they're gone the next year.